Thank you, Katy. Now we have fresh air, noise, and an innovative side event. Welcome, and this is the end of a long day before you're all off to hit Bonn nightlife. I'm at the side event called the Global Goal on Adaptation Ambition. The global challenge is more than the sum of its parts. Let me just tell you a little bit about the thought behind that title, because it created some confusion, apparently. The idea is that the Global Goal on Adaptation is there to create clarity about what we actually mean with strengthening resilience and adaptive capacity and reducing vulnerability. And we, of course, have this 2-year work program to create that clarity. We also have a global stocktake. It just came from the Technical Dialogue on Adaptation, which is inevitably going to conclude that we're not ambitious enough. We need more ambition on adaptation as well as on mitigation and means of implementation. Now, how can these two be connected? And particularly, what does ambition of adaptation mean if you start looking at the conclusions of the IPCC, which we'll hear about very shortly, that climate risk is actually more complex and more compound and cascading risks are becoming more of an issue, highlighting that adaptation is not only a local challenge, but also a systemic global challenge. Taking that into account, what does it then mean to enhance ambition of adaptation, and what does that mean for the Global Goal on Adaptation and the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program? That's what we want to talk about here. We have a fantastic panel of people who will not be using slides, but speak from the heart about their interpretations, their perspectives, their views on what adaptation ambition means and how it could be incorporated into the Global Goal on Adaptation in such a way that it does justice to those IPCC findings and the increasing realization that we are living in a very complex, interconnected world where indeed adaptation is much more than a local challenge. We have 5 speakers and 3 discussants. We'll start with Johanna Nalau, who was an IPCC, I can say was, right? Was an IPCC lead author, has worked on the chapter on small islands and on the adaptation parts of the summary for policymakers. She'll give a brief introduction into what the IPCC has actually said about this. Then we have, in an order that matters, Emilie Beauchamp from IIED, who is an expert on monitoring, evaluation, and learning. We have Thibyan Ibrahim from the government of the Maldives. We have Giuliana Torta from European Commission, DG Clima. And we have María del Pilar Bueno, who is a professor at CONICET in Argentina, also former co-chair of the Adaptation Committee and an ambassador of Adaptation Without Borders. I'll introduce the discussants after they've all spoken, and without further ado, no, I should do one more thing. We've got a fantastic audience here, but we also have a undoubtedly fantastic audience online. There are those of you who are watching on YouTube, enjoy. There are those of you who are watching within the system, and you can actually ask questions. And if you do that, we'll take them into account in the discussion. I will ask every speaker to be relatively succinct. We've asked them to speak for 7 minutes, so that after the discussions, there is indeed enough time for discussion. So without further ado, Johanna, the floor is yours.
Oh, there we go. Okay. Yes, Dr. Johanna Nalau, I am an IPCC author, I've been instructed to say, instead of was. So I was on the Small Islands chapters looking after writing the adaptation section, also co-managed the adaptation section of the SPM. So I'll have a few minutes to condense thousands and thousands of pages for you. So here we go, and I would just like to note that this is a collective effort, so I'll make a note when opinions are my own. So one of the questions that Richard posed was what is new about AR6 in terms of how we understand impacts and risks. And AR5 was considerably less detailed and less confident on the attribution of extremes in particular, and the relevance of them for risks. Human-induced extremes are becoming increasingly more frequent, but also more extreme, and in the form of compounded and cascading risks, and that means all of the risks are increasing in general. And this shows really when comparing the AR5 and the AR6 embers in particular. And what that means that we are approaching more adaptation is required, and we are reaching soft as well as hard limits a lot earlier than previously assessed in AR5. What it means for the compounding risk and impacts means that there are multiple impacts that occur at the same time. So you might have a category 5 cyclone, but you also have a COVID situation, which means that has a really big impact on people's decisions in, for instance, on whether they will be evacuating and how they interact with other people, especially in the aftermath of the disaster and the health implications of both. And we have more evidence of all of the risks since AR5, and we can trace the cascading effects of wildfires from the local effects to regional through worsening air quality. And we can also see the effects of compounding events, so heat and drought, especially for food production in Africa. And for the farmers, there are also cascading effects, so into lower outdoor labor productivity from the heat, lower wages, which means less income to take care of their families and purchase food, and then the more complex health effects and food insecurity. Some examples of compounding impacts would be, for instance, bushfires in Australia that we saw 2019-2020. So that had a massive global impact, but also just for people also in Australia, and obviously devastating impacts on the biodiversity. But people having to evacuate from their towns, and there was lots of impacts obviously on well-being, but also health from the air quality. So that's not like happy news. So what does that mean for adaptation? And I think one of the key messages coming out of this assessment is that there are feasible and effective options. But as we've said, the kind of window for some of those options is closing as well. We need to look at hybrid solutions. So we have, in the assessment, we looked at multiple benefits as well. But really understanding better the linkages and coordination and the multiple benefits that options can bring together. We did have a lot more focus on maladaptations. That's the unintended consequences of adaptation as well. And I think that really translates to these kind of transboundary issues. And this is something that I've heard a lot during these meetings on the global goal as well. So how do we measure something that is kind of collective adaptation, whereas at the national level, one country might choose to adapt in a way that really impacts, especially on the water management issues. And we have seen adaptation progress across regions, but there's a big gap still between kind of the planning and policies, and we are seeing increasingly that there are more. There's, I think, 170 countries have already plans for adaptation, but the implementation is really still lagging behind. And so we have in chapter 17, we have looked at also, well, how do you track progress and what the kind of methods are there for that. So AR6 is really dire news, but then I think the adaptation sections also show that we're not starting from scratch. And I think there's lots of options as social safety nets and social security issues, but also thinking about the well-being of both people and ecosystems. So that's me.
Thank you very much. Now it should be on. Yes, thank you very much, Johanna. The time allows me to ask you one quick question. As the IPCC concluded, and I think very rightly, that climate change and climate risk interacts with so many other non-climate issues, was there ever a discussion in the IPCC or among the authors, like, yeah, but issues of COVID, they're not really climate change, so they're not the purview of the IPCC, so therefore this is perhaps somebody else's mandate to talk about. Are we turning the IPCC into an intergovernmental panel on everything that ever matters to climate change?
Look, I mean, you know that we assess literature. So when COVID kind of hit, I mean, we were all impacted, but there wasn't also, much literature assessed. But I think, in terms of like compounding impacts in particular, I think it's really difficult nowadays to make the kind of separation that something is climate and something is not, because we live in complex systems and those interact. So as an IPCC author, I mean, it's insanely difficult to, try to assess the literature and try to pick up everything that impacts everything. But I think that is the role of a complex organization and complex adaptation science.
Right. We'll go straight to Emilie, and Emilie's going to give us a little bit of background on the work that you've been doing with stakeholders on the global goal and adaptation and how it fits into this conversation. Thank you.
Yes. Well, my brief was to say why the GGA is important, so I just took it away from there. So the GGA is important because it's the latest international monitoring, evaluation and learning, or MEL, framework to have to be designed. And that's for the Paris Agreement, but that's also for other international agreements of influence. And just for the audience virtually, I'll refer to MEL systems a lot now, and by this I mean the governance systems and structures for the management of data, information, evidence and learning that is used usually for policy and design and planning. So the GGA is the new kid on the block, and that is despite slow progress and let's call it a 6 years gestation period. From 2015 and the start of the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program. And this is an opportunity to leapfrog and to learn from what has worked and what hasn't worked in the development and implementation of international frameworks. So those who know me and know my research know that I am excited about the GGA because it's an opportunity to do a new type of dynamics in MEL and planning systems, to have systems that are country-led rather than top-down, and systems that respond and adapt to national and local priorities, needs, and circumstances. But I am also nervous because it's really easy to get stuck on methods, and the discussions during the class could become an empty exercise. So that's because there's still a lot of misunderstanding about technical methods, language use, the practical implications of certain approaches, and committing to different systems is actually quite hard for parties. The good news is there is a lot of materials and methods and approaches that are already available. And what we have heard this week in the GGA workshops and the Adaptation GST Roundtable is that parties are really keen to learn and exchange during the class using breakout groups, learning events, and other innovative methods to get on the same playing field. So there is ambition for something new, to be creative. But this isn't easy, and we must be careful not to fall back in old systems out of impatience or out of despair. So we need to remember what we've learned from to date from research and experience on top-down frameworks, and that is primarily that they don't lead to enhance action. There is no evidence there is very little evidence of that effectiveness. So top-down systems to date have tended to narrow down the use of MEL systems to tracking and reporting, rather than ongoing evaluation and learning. It brings MEL systems toward a one-sided accountability practice with little sense of contextualization and ownership in countries and in communities. This can lead to a string of meaningless aggregated indicators being just reported on for the sake of it. And truly, from what I've heard this week, I don't think parties, UNFCCC, and non-party stakeholders want that for the GGA nor the GST. So yes, complicated matrices and a complex set of indicators often bring a burden on countries, especially developing ones. But we need to realize something when designing the GGA is that any new system will create extra burden and extra work. But the innovative thing here is how we split that work and that burden. And that's where the ambition lies and the opportunity to enhance actions. So at the expanse of throwing a bit of a spanner, I want to pitch an idea that we've got from research and conversation with countries on a different way of working, because it seems there's an impression that we need a defined and precise global framework in order to drive MEL systems in countries. So instead, fast forward 10 years and imagine in your country where your country is invested in its own MEL system for adaptation and development, based on indicators and data collections that suits their needs and capacities, and engaging local and vulnerable people. So in other words, we want countries to be able to say, hey, I'm collecting this data, those experiences, this is a collective and including story, this is our adaptation story together. And I'm doing this, I have these results, and that's why I can say that I need this international community. I am communicating this through vehicles that, by the way, already exist, such as ADCOMs, NAPs, NDCs, BTRs, etc. And from this, international actors can synthesize, meta-analyze, compile, and review inductively the content from countries. And like this, the roles turn from designing and monitoring frameworks to the international community being analyzing and sharing learning. So to be a bit bold, from controllers to supporters. So yes, there's a work to do, but it's a collective burden that we need to share to achieve this ambition. And that can lead to country-driven DGA informing the GST and integrating linkages on SDGs, Sendai, at the national level, but also across transboundary levels. I'll just finish by saying that what this means for the class is that we need to use the next 2 years to get a shared agreement on these responsibilities and this new idea of a MEL system, delivering training and enhancing understanding of parties on starting and continuing to tell their adaptation story and build their MEL systems. So I may be seeing this opportunity through rose-tinted glasses, and I'd love to hear if my colleagues and the audience think that I'm delusional. I'd also love to make a little call to all the institutions that are supporting parties, so the Secretariat, donors, NGOs, to organize themselves and to really raise support for the call that we're clearly hearing from parties. And to parties and all individuals, please persevere in trying to imagine a new way of doing MEL systems in governance for adaptation, but for sustainable development as well.
Okay, thank you. Again, I mean, everybody's so good on the time, and this is really great. I just have one. I'm going to ask you to speculate. The GGA and the GLAS were negotiated before the IPCC came out with its sixth assessment report. Now, the sixth assessment report has said quite a few strong things about climate risk, how it's more complex, how it's compound and cascading. Does that knowledge affect how the GGA is now being implemented and what might come out of it?
That's a good question. I don't think it does, except if we want. I mean, the thing about the GGA is that one of the principles is that it's country-driven. Now, does it mean it's only countries and the national level that needs to decide and be involved? Absolutely not, because there's a duty of engaging, downward, but also upward. It's just that the level of responsibility really lies more at the national level as the bringer of actions, rather than the international level being a top-down implementer. And actually, I think that regional coordination, transboundary coordination would be much more meaningful on common adaptation and resilience issues when it's led between countries that are from the same region than from a global framework trying to organize regions, which we know doesn't work if we look at the history of colonization in the world.
Thank you. We're now moving to two government representatives, or negotiators, party representatives, I should say. First, Thibyan Ibrahim from the Maldives, and after that, Giuliana Torta from DG Clima.
Thank you so much. So my name's Thibyan. I'm from the Maldives. I work at the Ministry of Environment, Climate Change and Technology. I just want to highlight some of the elements of the GGA that are relevant to small island developing states. From a SIDS perspective, there are limitations currently on adaptation, and this is why the GGA is so important for other small island developing states. Because at present, neither actions, technical assistance, nor finance are adequate for SIDS to adapt to the impacts of climate change. On finance, we have yet to reach a balance between mitigation and adaptation finance, but the truth is we need far more resources for adaptation than balance could bring us. For many SIDS, the provision of finance for adaptation is inadequate and does not reflect the reality. If you look at Maldives specifically, in 2020, we produced a document regarding our country portfolio for what we would like to achieve from the Green Climate Fund. And we listed 22 funding proposals that were cross-cutting both mitigation, adaptation, obviously mainly mitigation as a small island, adaptation as a small island developing state. Of those 22 projects today, only 2 have been realized. 20 projects are still pending. We've struggled to get accredited entities to work with us on it. We've struggled to move them from a funding proposal to an actual project. So challenges like this exist. And when you look at NAPs, many SIDS struggle to implement their NAPs, and that is from the 8 SIDS who actually have NAPs. Maldives does not have one. There are so many struggles in acquiring private finance due to the low return that is often associated with adaptation projects. They're deemed unprofitable, and there are budget constraints of SIDS. We still have no choice but to allocate large chunks of our domestic budget for adaptation. In that regard, when we look at enhancing adaptation ambition, one example that I've been using throughout these sessions has been food security. And one component of the GGA, in our view, is to ensure stable food supply for food security. And a modest way to think about this is ensuring that people have stable access to nutritious food. We classified both within the Maldives and as AOSIS adaptation priority areas, and the 4 areas we identified were food security, water, health, and biodiversity. So just going on that food security example, one way to do this is in storing grain in grain silos so that the food supply is available in case of shocks. An ambitious way to think about stability in food is to think about food systems and how to make those systems resilient even in the face of climate change. And as we all know, supply chains are fragile. The IPCC special report on land and climate tells us that the stability of food supply could be at high risk, especially for countries and regions that rely on food imports, which include SIDS who don't have the space to or the climatic conditions to grow our own produce at the demand that we have. We want more information about actions that could help make food supply chains more resilient against shocks and slow onset changes. This would be an area for systemic investigation as well. Actions could be a global system of grain silos, forecast-based finance, networks of agriculture extension services. The point being that ambitious action means understanding the system and making the system more robust and resilient. One last point that I wanted to highlight was how we could make the GGA manage the transboundary effects of climate change and the transboundary climate risks. We believe that adaptation is implemented and envisioned locally. It is personal, but the elements should be global because we are dealing with a global goal on adaptation, and this should reflect the transboundary nature of climate impacts. All the people in the world, no matter what region you are from, face increased climate risks related to food security, water, health, and biodiversity that impede human well-being. And we believe that the GGA should address these items. In this regard, Maldives considers 5 elements that should be involved in the GGA: support, collective action, capabilities, and transformation. With support, we believe that countries, specifically vulnerable and small island developing states, need adequate resources, including finance and other means of implementation, to address adaptation needs, and that these resources should be coordinated, accessible, flexible, and long-term without creating excessive burdens to developing countries. For collective action, we believe that countries should undertake collective adaptation actions that are commensurate with current climate risks and anticipate future risks. This acknowledges any and all transboundary impacts and issues surrounding adaptation. For capabilities, countries should have the capabilities needed to address climate risks, with the greater capacity to plan, implement, and address emerging adaptation needs, which also requires adequate finance and technology. Lastly, transformation. The global goal on adaptation, we believe, should help build a just and better future, be forward-looking, and include a vision of transformational adaptation. So globally, when we believe that countries should have the adaptation actions being implemented, and that can be assessed to see whether that leads to human well-being. And with these 4 elements, we do believe that this can manage those transboundary effects and risks, and that's why it matters. Thank you.
Thanks very much. This microphone has its own mind, obviously. We'll go straight to Giuliana. Thank you. I do, but I'll just save it for later. Maybe I'll ask the same question to both of you.
So thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. So I'm working with the European Commission, so I'm part of the EU team negotiating and in the future this topic. I was thinking what to tell you in 5-6 minutes about the global goal on adaptation, and I thought maybe it's a good moment to take stock of what happened this week. We had a very intense week. So I can bring you some cynic views from the future negotiator of this topic. The first point is, Richa, you mentioned we are here to create clarity in the process. And actually, for me, that's already a big ambition. So there is a need to put clarity in the process, because beyond the definitions and the statement, we really need to work a lot on what to do together, and I'm coming to that. So we had the first mandated workshop on the global goal on adaptation, part of the 2-year GLAS. We had the first meeting of this as an agenda item, because now it is an agenda item in the UNFCCC framework. And based on the intervention from the floor, we see that there are a number of convergences already. So it's true that you can see that there are discrepancies as well, and there is the usual groups and countries dynamics, but there are a number of convergences that I think are important to quote. And of course, these are my views, but I'm pretty sure that, and please also participate in the discussion if you are part of any negotiation team or observers. There is a global idea that we really need to have a better understanding of what is the GGA. For the moment, the GGA means different things to different people. So you gave a view of what is the GGA, which is focused on M&A. But it's not the only one. It's considered a space for exchanging information and best practices, which is very important, but you can say, well, but you have already the Nairobi work program, there are other work streams as well. There is really the will not to have a top-down approach. So coming up with a sophistication of monitoring evaluation with targets and things which are just thrown top-down on countries will never fly. So that we really need to take that into account. There is also no will for extra burden for reporting. So no more reporting requirements, please. That's a very frequent message. But we share the same in the EU. We have a lot of reporting arrangements. We wouldn't like to have others. There is also the point, which is very important for also the dynamics of this meeting. What does it mean, the transboundary nature of the GGA? That's a point that it is frequently debated, but it's not clear. And there is a common understanding that the national and the local level are really key. They are the cornerstone of a global goal on adaptation. And there you enter into this interesting debate. You are facing with a global goal, but the national level is key. So how do we harmonize how do we bridge the two? What do we need to connect the two? So these are the point where you don't see a lot of tension, but then let's say the problematic parts come on the how. So how do we work together on the GGA? And how do we work together over these 2 years? Because let's be clear, adaptation didn't start with GLAS. It started even before Paris, before Paris. It will continue beyond GLAS. But we have 2 years as a space to advance in methods, in understanding, and in really achieving something that can guide national and local work. What is transboundary, as I said? What does it mean to be on a transboundary adaptation planning or strategy? Well, because, again, the government is in charge of implementing and developing an adaptation strategy. How do we measure the GGA? Very critical. If you want to measure, you need targets and indicators. Where do you find these targets and indicators? Can the SDGs help? And there were some parties saying, well, you know, we have, and we believe as EU that that's something that we need to explore. There's been a lot of work put on the Sustainable Development Goals. You have a lot of targets and indicators already there for climate and also other sectoral policy, as the colleague said. How do we use them? We're not clear there. And what common priorities can we use? Can identify some common policy areas which are important at a global level, like food security, water management? Can there be really another 2 cornerstones of the GGA? So as you see, there are a lot of questions at the moment, more than answers, but it's very important because we are at the beginning of this process of working together in workshops. We will have another 7 workshops over the next months and to conclude the 2 years, so that's very relevant. There was one party that already came up with some more articulated ideas saying we need to have a multi-layer approach to GGA. So you can have the national level, then you can have a risk assessment level, and then you can have the policies. But again, we need to build a model that can be shared with all countries in the world, or at least at regional level. So these are my first consideration, and I wait now with a certain nervosity the question.
Thank you very much, Giuliana. I managed to get it to work. Thank you. And I thought you were going to answer the question I was going to ask to both of you, but you haven't quite. So I'm going to ask it now. The subtitle of this side event is making global challenge more than the sum of its parts. And you talked about collective action as one of the pillars of your approach to the GGA. You've also mentioned transboundary climate risk, but the importance of national level action and involvement. But isn't there a risk then that if we basically make the GGA the sum of whatever happens at the national level, that we're missing out on what happens across countries, the interconnected nature of it? So, is there something that is more than the sum of the national challenges? Can I ask you first, Thibyan?
Let me try to answer that question. So in the Maldives' perspective, like I said, we do believe that adaptation is implemented nationally and locally because at the end of the day, a lot of impacts are very specific and there is a country context that has to be, not even a country context, but a local context that has to be acknowledged. But with the elements that I mentioned of support and collective action and capabilities and transformation, what we've tried to envision is that these can be measured in different ways so that you can measure support in a global measure and that it can be measured regionally and nationally and locally. So just for an example of support, what we thought could then have that sort of transboundary and cascading effect is that the element itself is that support is having adequate resources, including finance and other means of implementation, to address your needs. And a global measure would be the total global resources sufficient for scale and magnitude of global adaptation needs, whereas a national measure would be then, do these global resources flow into national contexts at sufficient scales, whereas the local measure would then be, and do those resources reach down to the local level without a heavy burden on those who are actually implementing it. So that's sort of how we've envisioned a global goal can have a global focus and also be transcending to the really specific local contexts. So I hope that answers it.
Well, I found a partial reply in IPCC, and so I can reply also to another question that you posed to another speaker. Is the IPCC report entering the glass discussion? Yes, it is entering the class discussion, but the how is also debated. How can we use all this wealth of information that has been given to us through the IPCC? So in the report, you have one key message is that we need to work together to improve assessment of progress towards goals. So this assessment of progress is something that can make it global. So until you have like a sum of NAPs, National Adaptation Plans, or initiative, but you never find a way to measure the progress that is made. It's also difficult to measure ambition because you keep setting ambition high, but then how do you measure what you have been doing against the ambition? So, but to do that, to assess the progress, again, you need to have something to measure. And there you get, again, in the discussion of targets, indicators, and avoiding the name and shame. I mean, you don't want to have country scoreboards. It probably doesn't even make sense because, I mean, the countries are so different. The means are different and the populations are different, everything is different. Maybe you want to have, we may consider regional aggregations. Could it help to have an assessment at regional level? How can we identify the vulnerable hotspot at global level? There is a vulnerability index, is not really formalized and recognized as the measure for vulnerability. So maybe we could also explore beyond that how we can do more work. But this assessment of progress is really what could make the difference.
Thank you. Our fifth speaker is Pilar Bueno from Argentina. And you're going to speak from the heart, you told me, so let's hear it.
That's unfair. You ask me, do you speak from the heart? I say, I always do that, sure, and with passion, because I am Latin American. Okay, a woman. Okay, said so. I'm being the last, so it's always an extra challenge after these amazing speakers. I receive different opportunities to talk today, and I want to make some comments, and probably nothing new for you, and nothing new in comparison to the previous speakers. And at the same time, that may be a good idea, since there are some areas of convergence here. I think that there are different ways to see and understand the GGA, and that's something that previous speakers also referred to, also different ways in order to understand progress in terms of adaptation. Some of them are, or I think all of them has been explored in some way, have been explored. Of course, the adaptation policy cycle, for me, one of the most important ones in terms of planning, implementation, monitoring and evaluation. Of course, the adaptation gap report model and many others. The action and support issue, and they are in-depth, the issue of effectiveness and adequacy, a lot of work done there, but still a lot of things to continue exploring on that regard. The issue of communicating and reporting, that I don't really think that is something completely different, because in each of these topics you may measure things, or how well you are planning, and how many plans do we have, and implementation, and the same with reporting instruments. So all of them can be measured in a qualitative and quantitative way. Of course, we have the issue of multi-level adaptation perspective and the targets. So if we have a top-down, a bottom-up, so at least, and it's not comprehensive at all, but at least some of those perspectives. I was thinking about the gaps and the needs, and I think that there are gaps and needs that in some way are different, referring to each of these perspectives, but at the same time there are some gaps and needs that are cross-cutting at some way. So they appear everywhere, in every report that we read for international organizations, for constituent bodies, and we read about the gaps in terms of adaptation information in particular, and data. So all the uncertainties that we have on the IPCC report was also clear on that regard. So there is a clear gap and a need there in order to continue strengthening information. Also articulation in terms of different governmental areas is something that we all the time refer to, but it's still there. Environmental language is not financial
language in our governments, just one of many examples. Of course, finance. So they are the big challenge, the main gap, mid, long-term finance. So all the relationship that even in this conversation during these 2 days of the global goal on adaptation wasn't there. And a lot of people saying why these conversations are not together. They are completely split. So that's a political decision, obviously. Then another point that I think it's quite related to what Emilie said, and probably because we are friends, so we are still starting to thinking together, and that's also good and bad at the same time. The narrative, we talk a lot about the narrative many times. So how all these pieces go together, the adaptation policy cycle with the communication and reporting, and to see the Paris cycle and the Paris architecture as from a holistic approach. So I was thinking of saying, do we really need to create something new? It's new, a good idea, or do we need to create more coherence? So that's the idea of creating your story, your narrative. So what do we need here? So what is need? And of course, all these things I mentioned and many others are in need because are already identified by countries and by organizations. Capacity building in order to build that story or that narrative is quite needed, and it's something that the countries all the time experience because we have a lot of burden in terms of reporting, on communicating, and all these reports start to clash. And okay, what are we going to report in the BTR, and how is that is relating with the outcome, and how that is related with the national communication and NDC and so all that narrative between the instruments, and more than that, between your objectives, your adaptation policy cycle. What do you want? How you're going to achieve that? How you measure that? That is quite more important. So, yeah, I'm running out of time, and I have a lot of things to say, but at least like 2 more, so I will not have questions. That's the good part. So that's strategy. Oh my God. So in terms of being ambitious, first of all, I thought, okay, now we are talking. Finally, we are talking about ambition and adaptation because for 30 years it was only mitigation. So yeah, a good one, a checklist for Saturday night. We are talking about adaptation ambition. That's a good news. In terms of what we think with ambition, I mean, what I think, of course, building capacity in terms of the diagnosis, and when we talk about diagnosis, again, nothing new but quite in need, and there the transboundary dimension is quite important, not only the traditional ones that when we talk about transboundary all the time, we are talking about shared resources, and for sure that is very important, and I think in my region is a priority, but at the same time, all the other issues, human mobility, for example, supply chains, capital flows, many other topics that need to be considered when we prepare the diagnosis, and many scientific evidence that need to be developed on that regard. To close information gaps, including South-South cooperation, to strengthen the relationship between MEL, as Emilie said, and assessing the collecting progress. So I think that I finish here, no worries. There are a lot of things to strengthen. My message here is I'm not so sure new in this case is to reinvent the wheel every time, every 5 years we have. It's like the addiction to carbon, you know? We have the addiction to creating new things. Do we really need to create new things? I really believe we need to create coherence at the national story, but also with respect to the local level, the transboundary level, and how all that levels can be articulated. Thank you very much.
Figured out how it works. Thank you. We have no time for questions. Thanks very much, 5 speakers who have given their perspectives, their views, and have an incredibly rich basis for further conversation, I think, not only here at this side event, but throughout the next 2 years and beyond. We have 3 people who will immediately reflect on this. So we're going to do a bit of musical chairs. I'm going to ask the speakers to change into the front row, and then we'll have Katy Harris, Mikko Ollikainen, and Annett Möhner as discussants. Katy Harris is a senior expert at the Stockholm Environment Institute and director of Adaptation Without Borders, and I'm sure that she'll spend maybe a few seconds talking about what Adaptation Without Borders is. Mikko Ollikainen is head of the Adaptation Fund Board Secretariat, and Annett Möhner wears several hats in the UNFCCC Secretariat in Glasgow. She was secretary of the governing bodies of the UNFCCC, and here in Bonn, she's working on several adaptation items. Katy, can we start with you?
Sure. Thanks so much. So we've heard quite a lot today, starting with the reflections from the latest IPCC report today around the extent to which we live in this interconnected world where a threat in one place can ripple out to cross countries and continents, to cascade from one sector to another, to even destabilize entire global systems and markets and supply chains, and really undermine and threaten sustainable development. And we've seen that, of course, all too readily with COVID-19, just how much our lives and our livelihoods are interdependent on one another. And our understanding of climate risk has to evolve for that context too. And I would suggest that that means adaptation, and our understanding of what adaptation is has to evolve as well. And I'm going to suggest that it evolves in 5 key ways, because why make 1 point when you can make 5? So, first of all, we all know that for too long and in too many places, adaptation has been too slow, too small in scale, too incremental to meet the needs. And one of the reasons, perhaps, has been that while mitigation has been considered a global problem, adaptation has been considered a local one. And while there are very legitimate reasons why adaptation should be locally led, I think it's quite naive to think that local actors always are equipped with the global outlooks and the global information that they would need, never mind the global mandates, to successfully adapt to cascading and transboundary climate risks. So I think we need a reframing of adaptation as a global challenge, the global challenge that the Paris Agreement articulated it to be. And we need more clarity, as Giuliana said, on what this means and the implications of that. Second, I think we need to rethink our assumptions that adaptation is only the concern of developing countries who are most directly at risk from experiencing the impacts of climate change. Having done the least to cause this crisis and with the fewest resources to cope, there is, of course, a moral case, a humanitarian responsibility to focus global support on adaptation in such countries. But our studies at the SEI show that all countries will be affected by cross-border and cascading climate risks, irrespective of their location, their affluence, their levels of power. And it's in everyone's interest to strengthen the resilience of our global systems to these systemic risks. So wealthier countries need to step up their support of adaptation to these risks and recognise that it is in their own interests to act in the collective interest in that regard. Thirdly, we need to recognise that adaptation isn't inherently benign. So just as risks from climate change can cascade, so too can the effects of our adaptation responses, and this can create winners and losers. So while an export ban, for example, might be a really effective adaptation strategy for a producer country that is experiencing a decline in its agricultural yields as a result of climate change, if those reliant on those exports in other countries face increased food insecurity as a result, then we're looking at redistributing vulnerability rather than reducing it outright. If we're going to build effective risk management, effective risk governance, rather than generate a propensity for a kind of crisis reaction in adaptation, then our current approaches to adaptation that shed very little light on how countries might be exposed to climate risks from abroad, but also in turn export risks to others, they require a rethink. So we need much greater communication and coordination of adaptation plans. Fourth, as has been mentioned here a few times and throughout the last few days, we need to think about adaptation to multiple risks simultaneously. There are at least 4 or 5 interlinked crises facing global governance at the moment, including war and contested geopolitics, and a looming debt and financial crisis, food crisis, and energy crisis, in addition to the climate and biodiversity crisis. And we can't tackle these in silos. We need policies that are integrated, that, as Pilar just said, that are coherent in managing these risks, that recognise the trade-offs that will inevitably result, and that really build resilience from a systemic perspective. And we need stakeholders in foreign ministries, in finance ministries, in trade ministries, and others to see that they have a critical role to play in adaptation, especially to risks that may originate beyond a country's jurisdiction. And finally, and fifth, so as a delegate from Papua New Guinea said in the Glass workshop earlier this week, and as the title of this event reflects, we need to understand that global resilience to climate change is more than the sum of our individual, national, local efforts, as you were suggesting, Richard. We need, I think, much greater cooperation in adaptation if we're to build a resilient world. And this makes the concrete operationalization of the global goal and adaptation, and a goal that raises ambition to manage these sorts of transboundary and cascading climate risks, I think, more critical and urgent than ever.
Thank you very much. And you've missed your opportunity to explain what Adaptation Without Borders is, but maybe you can do that later. Mikko, can I turn to you, please?
Can you hear me? Great. Thank you, Richard. Great to be here. I'm Mikko Ollikainen from the Adaptation Fund. The Adaptation Fund funds concrete adaptation projects in developing countries, and we've been doing that for almost 15 years. We have a 15th anniversary at the end of this year. I haven't prepared points, so I'm just going to reflect on what everyone has said, if that's okay. It's actually quite interesting to be in this space because there are a lot of academics here, there are a lot of people, there are representatives of countries, and we as funders are somehow in the same picture, but not really exactly at the same position. We of course want to be first and foremost be responsive to what countries need, what their adaptation needs are, but at the same time we are trying to do what we do in a way that is in line with the best technical knowledge that's out there on how to best adapt, and that knowledge is of course accumulating all the time and is reflected in the IPCC reports, but also elsewhere. So we're kind of trying to manage between these two different worlds. It's great to see the huge enthusiasm on the GGA process during this session, and it's quite not surprising that there are different views on how to best address that, how to best define it. But I see it as the whole globe trying to make sense of this very complex challenge, very urgent challenge. We are in a climate emergency, so we also don't have a whole lot of time to react to it. I found it interesting, Katy, as you referred to adaptation as a global challenge. I think it is that. It is a global challenge if we look at how everything accumulates the global needs, and there are many needs that are not country-specific, but that are regional or global, and we are also working on those some of those regional and global needs. We just published a report on the 18 multi-country projects that we are supporting or have supported in different parts of the world, and there are some interesting lessons that arise from that body of experience from practical projects on adaptation. So Johanna was making a comment on was talking about the compounding and cascading effects of impacts. What we found in our projects, which is not published in any peer-reviewed publication so far, is that there's also compounding resilience. So we've discovered that during the pandemic, communities that have been supported to become more resilient for climate change have actually become more resilient also to other shocks, such as the pandemic. They've been better equipped, for example, through diversified livelihoods to deal with the sudden change of not having access to markets or the market of certain produce suddenly disappearing, or being able to produce protective equipment that before masks became available everywhere. So things like that, just as sporadic and examples, but I think nevertheless quite interesting. And linking back to the question, so what are we aiming at? Is it climate change or something bigger? And I guess we all can further think about that question. On maybe just on the technical or technical sounding question on monitoring and evaluation and how to best do that. I think and now maybe talking from a personal perspective, as we are in an emergency, we should not make the perfect the enemy of good. So we should get going, we should develop systems, and I like the suggestion from the EU representative on perhaps picking some sectors that could be priorities and starting from there, piloting and seeing what works and developing the rest of the parts as we go. Let me stop here. Thanks.
Thank you. And then, last but not least, Annett Möhner. What does this all mean for the process?
That is a good question, which I'm going to dodge, because I was very grateful that Giuliana already talked a lot about the process. So I'm taking this opportunity to, having heard all the intervention before, to actually reflect a little bit more on what does it actually mean to be ambitious? What does adaptation ambition really mean? Building on what Pilar has said. And I also like the reference from Mikko that they had their 15th anniversary, which reminded me that the UNFCCC had its 30th, so we're double the age. And indeed, adaptation came a long way, but I think we all agree we're nowhere near where we should be. So the next hope is that the Global Goal and Adaptation Work Program will actually help us to get there and enhance our adaptation ambition. So we know the starting point where we're currently. Johanna eloquently told us we're basically in dire need of support. And we kind of also know the direction of travel, because the Global Goal and Adaptation says we have to enhance our adaptive capacity, we have to reduce the vulnerability, and we have to increase the resilience. So we know the direction. Unfortunately, the destination is rather uncertain and also unclear. Uncertain in a way, and I think that's one thing we need to draw out, is the strong link with mitigation. So how far we have to travel depends on mitigation ambition, meaning how much the pledges, but even more importantly, who's actually following up on them. So if that is falling through, it's going to be like in the desert where you see the Fata Morgana and you're trying and trying to reach it, but you're never going to reach it. At the same time, of course, traveling is very much determined by whether or not we have the means of traveling, the means of implementation. Do we actually have enough finance, technology, and capacity to actually start the travel, and then the ease of travel? A third aspect of our travel and our destination are the national circumstances, and we had a few here. Ultimately, it also depends on how far society wants that target to be. How much risk am I willing to take? Do I want to reduce risk to almost zero? That, of course, requires a lot of resources. Or am I willing to take more risk on and then use a risk transfer mechanism, or just take a gamble? And that is something, for some countries, they wouldn't be faced with a choice because they wouldn't even have the necessary resources. But for others, it's a more conscious choice to actually then decide how easy they would travel. So if we stretch the travel a little bit more and we want to say we want to raise the ambition, we could say we want to have more travel, we want to be faster, and we want to be better. So more means do we actually have everyone on board? And that came out in the workshops, that we said we don't want to leave anyone behind, whether it's people, whether it's ecosystems, or even sectors. When we want to travel faster, many point to means of implementation, and concretely pointing to the Global Climate Fund, it's been years and years and years that we've seen national adaptation plans, but where's the implementation? So we're always being stuck in the planning phase, but we never really advance, and it's been a moving yardstick, so to say. We also need to ease access of finance. I know the Adaptation Fund is also doing a lot in that regard, direct access, but I think more can be done. And we could even span as far as going to budget support instead of being stuck in the project by project. And then finally, it needs to be better. Better in a way that we link with the Sustainable Development Goal. So we look at the context, we look at the principles. We do have to acknowledge, as Katy said, that there are trade-offs and there are linkages, and we have to acknowledge those trade-offs and ensure that there is a just resilience when we travel, so that basically everyone is coming along. We have the trade-offs at community level, but also countries and regions, and I think this is where some of the transboundary aspects come in. So finally, if we look at those dimensions, hopefully the Global Goal and Adaptation Work Program can help us to have more adaptation, faster adaptation, and better. We have the workshops lined up for 2022, focusing on enhancing implementation and action. We have a workshop looking more concretely at monitoring and evaluation, and also at communication and reporting. So hopefully we will have this exchange, we will understand the directions and destinations better, but at the same time, as Pilar said, at the end of the day, we'll be judged whether or not there has actually been any movement, rather than just talking about the travel. We actually need to travel, otherwise it's just going to be another talk shop, and we've had way too many over the past. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Annett. Speaking of travel to Fata Morganas, earlier today, I was co-moderating the technical dialogue on adaptation as part of the global stocktake, and the issue of the link between the GGA and the GST came up, and as a moderator, I wasn't really able to say what I'm now going to say, which is that, how could we possibly take stock of something, collective progress towards a goal that we don't quite understand? It's not even that the goalposts are shifting, we don't even have the goalposts yet. And if we have, if we go by Annett's analogy, these goalposts might even be a Fata Morgana. That said, thank you very much to all the speakers and the discussants. You've been absolutely amazing in both inspiring the audience, but also in giving them sufficient time to provide feedback, thoughts, ideas, and questions. And I see already 2 hands. And could you please introduce yourself, even if everybody already knows you, and be concise, please.
Thank you so much. My name is Ana Guzman. I'm from the Climate Policy Initiative. Well, first of all, thank you so much for this rich exchange. It has been really, really interesting. I have a question about precisely how to connect the dots, something that you already mentioned. We have been discussing adaptation, finance, and mitigation for so long. Now we finally have 2 very important processes, the adaptation goal and the new finance goal. And the key question is how we are going to connect these processes. And a lot of comments are around, we are in an early stage, but if we don't start connecting the dots in this early stage, we are going to lose the opportunity to really bring really useful connections. So I would like to hear from you, what are those key processes, key decisions that have to happen, for instance, in the COP27 to start connecting those? And just very quickly, last year, there was published this NEEDS report. The Standing Committee on Finance published a NEEDS report. I had the opportunity to participate on that one. And it was really shocking that it's true that there is not clarity about how much the adaptation action costs. Not all the countries have been able to assess those elements, and if we don't have those numbers, it's really difficult to assess then how much really cost. I mean, there are a lot of top-down studies, but no one single study that really addresses what's the cost of adaptation from a bottom-up approach. And if we don't have those numbers, it's going to be very difficult to have a real goal on climate finance goal for adaptation that really reflects clarity, that reality. So I would love to hear from you, what are those steps and what needs to happen in COP27? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and hold your thoughts. And this is, of course, both to the discussants and the speakers. And I'll be walking around and get some exercise in the meantime. Salim.
Great, thank you very much to all the speakers. Excellent presentations. I'm Salim. I'm the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development. And most of my work is very much with the most vulnerable communities in the most vulnerable countries to build their capacity, adaptive capacity. And one of the things that we do is we run a network, a global network of local adapters. We call it the Gobeshana Global Adaptation, Locally Led Adaptation Network, Gobeshana being a Bangla word for research. We feel very strongly that a locally led element needs to be front and center in the global goal. My question is specifically to Annett. How are we going to do that in the 8 workshops over the glass? All right? And we're looking at you very, very critically. All right? We don't want more top-down discussions. We want bottom-up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see Benito and Colin.
Thank you very much. Benito Müller from Oxford. 2 things. The first one is adaptation needs, which determine for what, the goal. I mean, it's a simple one is we have all these NAPs that need to be financed. That's fairly straightforward. But then you can say, do we really need all these projects? All that sort of stuff, right? Annett made a very good point, which I was going to make too, and I'm making it now, okay? Adaptation needs and mitigation provision are linked, right? I mean, those of us who go back, we remember the Global Climate Coalition with Don Perlman. They just said, Exxon, we don't need to mitigate, we just adapt. That is a global adaptation goal, okay? It's not exactly what we now think is the... So what I think we also need to look at is how can we formulate the global needs for adaptation, not monetarily, but in terms of relative to temperature scenarios, right? So you have 1.5, that gives you a risk profile. If it's 2, it's different. Maybe you cannot do adaptation and actually go back to the old one.
Thank you. I'm going to hand the mic to Colin and then give the opportunity to the speakers and discussants to respond.
Thanks, Richard. That's right. Russell.
Yeah, Russell.
Yeah.
You look different with your mask.
I know, everybody does. It's terrible, isn't it? So Russell Miles, I'm the Director of Adaptation and Loss and Damage and Resilience for the Australian Government. So thanks everybody for the great discussion. I have a few things. One is, Richard asked me, can you please explain the Adaptation Without Borders, please, Katy? Just as what we call a Dorothy Dixer in our parliament. But more seriously, I think when we think about transboundary risks, a lot of those adaptation is probably organised by different forums. Like, for example, in the Glasgow dialogue today, Pilar was talking about the tuna fishery and how that's moving, and that's managed by a regional fisheries agreement, so that it's done there. So I guess the question is, what's the role of the UNFCCC to help in guide some of those things? And then just quickly for Mikko, I think Johanna texted me to say, I think everybody just wrote down compounding resilience, because that's quite exciting, because we often talk, the narrative of adaptation is quite, we're not doing enough, it's not good enough, we're not moving, but that's a very positive statement. And so I think my question to you is, like, how do we, in terms of what Annett was talking about, how do we reach a more positive, ambitious vision of adaptation that we can all aim for, and that's more exciting than what we're currently hearing. So, and I thought, I'm going to make a T-shirt with compounding resilience, because I think that's the sort of narrative that we need. Thanks. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you, Russell. Can I ask first the discussants to respond to the various questions that are relevant to them, and then we'll come to the speakers. Annett, please.
I knew there was a drawback for remaining seated here. On the first question, connecting the dots, indeed, and you may have noticed that a lot of parties raised the ominous term of complementarity between all the various work programs that we have launched. And to be honest, no one really has the golden answer yet. On the one hand side, the mitigation work program is still being shaped up. The finance work program has a longer time horizon. We're talking 2025. And then, of course, the GST and the adaptation work program, they're aligned in that they finish in 2023. So in an ideal world, the outcomes of the GST and the adaptation work program will inform the formulation of the new financial goal. It's expected that the needs will continue to rise by the time so that the goal will rise accordingly. In terms of how to formulate the needs according to temperature scenarios, yes, on the one hand, the means of implementation will be the soft limits, but we heard, and also for the SIDS, we are facing hard limits. So where incremental adaptation will no longer be possible. So the question is how to formulate those needs. Do you then, in your adaptation planning, already plan for a 3-degree or 4-degree, or are you the very optimistic one that believes, okay, the party's committed to the 1.5 and I'm going to plan accordingly? But I think the past will have shown you that it would be more sensible to plan for the higher scenarios. We've also had a proposal in the past where a group of parties put forward to quantify the impacts as per scenario and then also monetize them. And then basically the global goal in adaptation was a single dollar figure according to temperature scenarios. That is an option. It will unlikely be met with consensus, but I think intellectually it's good to exchange on those. And on how to engage the communities, I think what the workshops have also shown is that while we are all willing to discuss and come together in 8 workshops, when it comes to the planning, we're facing these budget constraints. So most of the workshops are being done in session with a lot of negotiators, and then there's a hard time to bring quote unquote more real people into the room. So hopefully that while the online workshops have drawbacks, and we do acknowledge the time zones and also connectivity, especially for developing countries, we still see that it allows for broader participation. We worked in COVID time. We've seen in some of the meetings of our constituted bodies, we reached new audiences, and hopefully that will also happen under the Global Goal and Adaptation workshops, where we'll try to reach out to communities to allow them to showcase and to allow for that exchange. So, and I'm happy to take lots of suggestions for those workshops too. Thank you.
Perfect. Katy, please.
Thanks so much. I also loved the idea of compounding resilience, so maybe I'll just speak for a second or two on that. But yeah, I think we really recognise that it's not just risks that can be cascading and transboundary and cross-border in nature, but that also adaptation can be, and that can offer a lot of opportunities. If you look at adaptation to a transboundary or a cascading or a systemic climate risk, then adaptation investment in one place can have this ripple out effect and potentially sort of increase exponentially the resilience of groups living many thousands of miles apart. So I think that there are lots of opportunities to really, for this to be a real driver of adaptation, if we recognise this sort of transboundary perspective. And this idea of compounding resilience is one we should all seize and be looking into and exploring a lot more. And in that vein also, we could be seeing a lot more in countries' national adaptation plans, the sort of the contributions that their own adaptation measures are making to regional and global resilience. And it's a way to really build bridges and to forge and strengthen cooperation and adaptation. So I think it's a really exciting topic. In terms of sort of the role, maybe speak to the UNFCCC because Annett covered it, but sort of in guiding adaptation efforts beyond the climate community to the trade community and so on. We also see this as a big issue, even when we've tried to host sort of roundtables and dialogues within Adaptation Without Borders, which I'll come on to in a moment. As soon as you put the word climate in the title, the invitation gets forwarded to environment ministries, even if you're trying to actively get trade policymakers in the room, for instance. So we're trying to do a lot of work with those sorts of observer organisations and non-state actors and so on who have really good links to the private sector. Within Adaptation Without Borders, we have BSR, who's a partner who work with 200 companies, and we're really trying to set up some dialogues that really show the sort of the role that policymakers and practitioners kind of within trade and within sort of supply chains can play in terms of adaptation efforts. But it's an ongoing effort to, I think, for them to see that adaptation is within their remit. And then, yeah, so Adaptation Without Borders, shameless plug, is a global partnership. We're here trying to support and work towards more cooperation in adaptation, particularly to manage cascading climate risks. Our first institutional supporter is the European Union, and we have 3 pillars to our work. One, to sort of understand empirically and conceptually these sorts of risks, so better tools to identify and assess and measure these sorts of risks and understand how they're impacting our ecosystems and economies and societies around the world. Then we have a big strand of policy engagement where we're working at a global level in forums such as this, but also regional level, where there's some really exciting developments. For instance, that Africa's new 2022 to 32 climate change strategy has an explicit action to strengthen regional cooperation to manage these sorts of risks. So we're interested in how we can support that. And then also on planning and implementation. So what does it mean to work with locally driven adaptation processes and work with local actors to equip them with the information they need to manage these sorts of risks. And we're really supporting locally led adaptation. It has to be context specific. We have to see a diversity of adaptation approaches, but we think there's a much greater need, and we really hear that from a local level, for access to information and understanding to manage these sorts of risks. Thanks.
Thank you. Mikko, there was one question specifically to you. I'm not going to put any of the speakers on the spot, but if you want to respond to any of the questions, then just let me know. I see Emilie and Pilar. Great. Mikko, please.
Thank you. Yes, it is an interesting topic on this compounding resilience. And I started thinking about it, so it actually does also link to the what the global goal on adaptation is trying to achieve, which is measuring something that is extremely complex. And then how do you draw the lines of what do you measure? Is it only the things that are somehow within the remit of the climate convention, or will you also start measuring things on the other SDG goals, and how easy would that be? So I hope that at some point in the future, humankind will be at the point where we can measure all impacts and all risks and everything, but I guess we are not going to be there anytime soon, and we need to think practically. So just how we approach this particular question as a climate fund. Well, our the low-hanging fruit, which has been from the beginning, is the do no harm. So when we look at impacts of these adaptation activities, we follow environment and social policy that has 15 principles, including on biodiversity and land degradation and other things, so that we would not cause maladaptation as we go along, or that we would not cause harmful impacts in other areas of sustainable development. There are 2 areas at the moment where we are actually adding a goal that goes beyond short-term or this short and medium-term adaptation. As such, one of them is the longer-term adaptation goals on the area of knowledge management. Each project, since the very beginning, it has been mandatory to have a knowledge management component, so that we capture information, lessons learned, and that we're able to share them to the wider community. That's still within adaptation, but it's sort of outside of the immediate scope of the projects. The other is gender, and there it's clear that addressing gender aspects in projects makes the projects better. It makes them more sustainable, it makes them more effective. But there's a significant parallel goal, which is the goals of the UN Declaration on Rights of Women, which is also as a UN fund we need to adhere to and aim at. So it's something that's where we are starting. Hopefully we'll be able to cover all the other aspects as well at some point. Thank you.
Thanks, Mikko. And going to give the floor to Emilie and Pilar. I understand that there was a question online as well, so we'll go to that in a minute.
Thank you. And I mean, the good thing is I think I'm not delusional or not that delusional, which is a great news for me as well. And I really want to, coming from a male person who loves systems and data, this means a lot if I say, I think we're really getting bogged down to methodologies and saying there's not enough data. I need to say, I don't think we'll ever have all impacts and risk, and I don't think we want that at all. We won't have similar systems across countries. That is not desirable. We have to respond to the steps. We already have so much information. We don't need something new. What we need is, well, I mean, I don't know if it's something, but we need new attitude and a new vision and new roles. So the steps to me is take the data we already have. I was looking up, and there's a report from the African group, negotiator group, sorry, what's their name? Basically the expert support group that's published last October that says they have more than 400 indicators on adaptation in climate and development. EOSIS report on GGA says they have about 300 indicators already. We have indicators by the buckets. We have approaches and dimensions of resilience and adaptation. By the way, Thibyan, I love the dimensions that you've proposed in terms of kind of shaping or framing maybe global dimensions. But at the national level and regional level, we don't need more indicators. There are methods. And also, who are we, the international community, to actually say, hey, countries, use this. That's not okay. So, and I think that what the thing is new, like Giuliana mentioned, is that assessment. So adding roles and function at the international level to do this assessment, but also in countries, so we can look at all the data and valorize it and see where we need to go. Last, I'm just going to say that I forgot, so that's great.
Thank you. Pilar.
Thank you. Okay, I will refer to the question on the dots from Sandra. Also because it's a depth, we were talking during the whole week about this. For me, this is the shadow in the room during the whole week, so it's quite important. And probably I have like two perspectives there. First of all, one of the messages that I wanted to give during my presentation was that it's quite important to be more comprehensive than indicators. Okay with indicators, but indicators is just a tool, and we need to go beyond indicators. We can use indicators, yes, for sure, but before we have a lot of work to do, yeah, I'm sorry, Annett, a lot of work to do before indicators. So, and that work and talking about the dimensions that that we were trying, and I think all of us refer to different type of dimensions in some way, dimensions, sectors, and I think all of that is quite complementary. So, I mean, if we talk about adaptation policy cycle, for sure, every single point of that adaptation policy cycle refer to long-term finance. So we really need long-term finance when we talk about planning, implementing, and monitoring and evaluation. That's for sure. Then if you want to talk about data, gaps, research, education, that I would really like to go after the 2-year program and to say, oh, okay, we have a new research program on adaptation, including transboundary risk, for example, and not only the traditional things that we obtain here. Also, in terms of communicating and reporting. So on communicating and reporting, we also need long-term finance. On governance, we are paying by ourselves all the governance issues that are quite expensive, quite difficult. We are not exchanging enough with respect to that, and the same with assessing costs. So I think that the dimensions plus sectors perspective can be very useful in order to build bridges between finance and the GGA. And I'm not saying anything new, but unpacking the GGA for me is unpacking finance.
Thanks very much. I'm afraid not, Emilie.
Because cascading risk needs cascading responsibilities.
Oh, that's a nice one. Compounding resilience, cascading responsibilities, connecting the dots in a direction of travel towards a Fata Morgana. Question online. We have a few minutes to address that, maybe.
The question is by Saskia Werners, working with United Nations University. She's put forward a possible framework for the global goal, proposing a framework of 4 pillars. So the first one around a common target, the second, sort of the 3 pillars of the global goal as it's defined in the Paris Agreement, thirdly around adaptation actions, and fourthly around adaptation plans. I'm going to propose that maybe we comment on this in detail. She's provided her email address afterwards, and we can gather some responses from the panel. But perhaps it's just useful if anyone's got any comments to say on a possible framework for the global goal, or any way in which we think we can advance concrete progress on the global goal. Maybe it's, if I take the liberty to reinterpret her question.
Do you also sense that my authority as a moderator is being undermined here? No, that's great, because we are reaching the end of our session. The security already came in to kick us out. I think this has been a great conversation. It's obviously the start of a conversation, and it should continue. Do you want to be part of this conversation? Then please do get in touch. We'll find ways to involve people in whatever way possible. As Katy said, the European Commission has been so kind to provide support to Adaptation Without Borders that enables us to do some work on what the global goal and adaptation within the context of cascading systemic cross-border risks might mean. It's funding for 1 year, so we're not going to see the end and the Fata Morgana of it, but we hopefully will be able to make a useful contribution to the process, and if you want to be part of it, please let us know. On that note, I would like to thank very much each of the 5 speakers and each of the 3 discussants and each of you online and here in the room. Thank you very much.